The discovery of the Donnelly family's hidden settlement begins with an atmosphere of hushed suspicion that has clung to the surrounding region for generations, a lingering sense of unease that locals pass down the way other communities hand down recipes or family heirlooms. The settlement's existence was never officially recorded on any map, nor did it appear in census reports or property ledgers, yet every elder in the nearby towns could recall stories their parents whispered about a cluster of homesteads deep in the forest where the Donnellys lived out their long and peculiar lineage. These stories always came with the same warning: don't go looking for them. But no one ever explained why, and perhaps that omission is what kept the mystery alive long enough for someone, decades later, to be drawn toward the woods in search of answers. The forest itself seemed to resist intrusion, dense and overgrown, as if time had coiled around it tighter than around the rest of the world. The path leading toward the old settlement was barely visible beneath thickets of bramble and roots twisting like skeletal fingers across the ground. Those who lived in the nearby towns avoided this part of the land with a quiet determination. Hunters chose other terrain, hikers followed safer trails, and even loggers claimed their tools dulled too quickly when they worked near the Donnelly woods. These were superstitions on the surface, but beneath them lay a collective memory heavy with unease, because the Donnellys had not simply been reclusive, they had been wrong in ways no one ever dared to define. Stories persisted of children born with mismatched eyes, limbs that grew too long before their bones caught up, or voices that echoed strangely, as though the sound came from multiple throats instead of one. But these were rumors, distortions whispered by people who never ventured close enough to confirm what they believed. Still, the whispers carried the weight of truth, and over time, a fog of fear settled over the Donnelly name. When the settlement was discovered or rediscovered, it happened not because someone sought danger, but because a curiosity stronger than fear pulled a researcher into the forest. They followed an old boundary line found in a crumbling county document, not expecting to stumble upon anything significant. Yet as they pushed deeper into the woods, they began to sense the unmistakable traces of human habitation that nature had not fully reclaimed. A rusted hinge peeking from beneath moss, the collapsed outline of what might have once been a shed, and the scattered remnants of hand-carved fence posts hinted at a place where people had lived not just briefly, but for generations. Soon, the forest began to change in subtle ways that suggested careful, deliberate shaping. Trees grew in strange patterns, too evenly spaced for nature alone to dictate. Thorny underbrush gave way to narrow corridors of open earth, almost like forgotten walkways. The air felt heavier, tinged with a metallic sharpness that suggested decay, age, and something else, something that seemed to linger in the soil itself. As the researcher pressed further, they noticed signs that the settlement had been abandoned in haste rather than over time. Windows had been smashed inward, doors broken from their frames, and belongings scattered as though their owners had fled without packing. River stones stacked into low walls bore deep gouges, as though large hands, or tools, had scraped across them in violent desperation. The silence was not the gentle, peaceful quiet of an abandoned homestead but a suffocating stillness that suggested the forest itself was holding its breath. The main house emerged at the heart of the settlement, and its condition revealed more about the Donnelly family's final days than any of the smaller structures scattered around it. Though weathered, it still stood with a strange resilience, as if built from timber that resisted rot the way bone resists fire. The roof sagged in places, yet parts of it looked almost newly reinforced. Windows were boarded from the inside, not the outside, a detail that cast a shadow across any comforting narrative about the family's retreat. They hadn't been trying to keep outsiders from entering, they had been trying to keep something inside. When the researcher entered the building, they found walls filled with markings that resembled a mix of family trees and medical diagrams, as though someone had attempted to merge genealogy with anatomy. Names repeated across multiple generations, written in increasingly frantic handwriting. Symbols appeared beside certain individuals: circles, crosses, downward-pointing arrows, and though their meaning was unclear, the pattern hinted at classification, perhaps even experimentation. The deeper the researcher went, the more apparent it became that the Donnellys had been documenting something they couldn't understand and couldn't escape. They had been tracking changes, mutations, and anomalies that intensified with each generation. The discovery of these records transformed the settlement from a relic of the past into a puzzle with stakes far greater than local law. It was no longer a question of what happened to the Donnelly family, but what they had carried within them and why they had gone to such lengths to hide themselves from the world beyond the forest. The arrival of the young biology researcher marked more than just the entrance of a curious mind into forbidden territory. It represented the first intrusion into the Donnelly mystery by someone who did not carry the inherited fear that had kept locals silent for generations. The researcher was driven by a blend of academic ambition and an instinctive pull they struggled to articulate, a feeling that the fragments of information they had uncovered were pointing toward something extraordinary, something that had quietly defied every scientific framework they had ever studied. Their fascination began months earlier, when they found a weathered medical ledger tucked into a box of abandoned artifacts donated to the university archives. The ledger was dated more than a century ago and belonged to a rural physician whose notes were methodical, almost obsessive. Between cases of fever, childbirth, and farm injuries, there were entries that abruptly shifted into descriptions of symptoms that bordered on the impossible. Children born with unusual skeletal proportions, patients who healed at inexplicably rapid rates, and individuals whose blood behaved unpredictably when exposed to certain conditions. Each of these cases shared a single surname, Donnelly. What unsettled the researcher most was not the strangeness of the physician's accounts but the tone that seeped through the aging ink. The doctor wrote not with scientific detachment but with an undercurrent of dread, as though he feared what he recorded. His final entries grew hurried, fragmented, and abruptly stopped without explanation. No further records of his practice existed after that point. For most people, this would have been the end of the trail, but the researcher could not let it go. They requested access to surrounding county archives, then church registries and old property maps, only to find a consistent pattern of erasure. The Donnelly name appeared in one generation and vanished in the next. Births were recorded with no corresponding deaths. Whole family units appeared in early census records, only to be entirely absent a decade later. It was as if someone had deliberately scrubbed their existence from official documentation, leaving only faint traces in forgotten corners of local history. The researcher was trained to read biological anomalies as opportunities to expand scientific understanding, but this felt different, heavier. They sensed a hidden narrative threaded through each vanishing record, and the more they searched, the more they felt the weight of secrets long buried. Their colleagues dismissed the project as a distraction, an unsolvable tangle of folklore and unreliable documentation. But something in the researcher refused to let the trail go cold, and that persistence led them to the mountain town closest to the rumored Donnelly settlement. From the moment they arrived, they sensed the resistance. Conversations halted when they entered a room. People avoided eye contact whenever they asked about old families or rural disappearances. The sheriff politely warned them that outsiders often misinterpreted the region's history and that digging into the past tended to stir up trouble rather than enlightenment. Yet the more the townsfolk resisted, the more certain the researcher became that the truth lay somewhere nearby, buried under fear rather than ignorance. The turning point came when an elderly woman, stooped, soft-spoken, and trembling, slipped a folded piece of paper into the researcher's hand as they left a small diner. She offered no explanation, only a whispered plea to be careful what you wake. The paper contained hand-drawn directions leading into the forest and a date scrawled at the bottom, more than 60 years old. It was the first time anyone in the town had acknowledged the Donnelly name without evasion, and it confirmed what the researcher already suspected. The townspeople knew far more than they admitted and were terrified of even speaking the truth aloud. Armed with the old map, the researcher ventured into the woods, determined to follow the faint path toward the long-abandoned settlement. But they did not enter the forest solely as an observer. They brought with them the ledger, notebooks filled with genetic analysis, and equipment for collecting biological samples. They came prepared to examine whatever anomalies the Donnelly records hinted at, certain that the explanation, no matter how strange, would ultimately fall within the boundaries of science. Yet as they traveled deeper into the woods, they felt something unfamiliar threading through their resolve. It was not fear exactly but a sense of being drawn forward, as if the forest itself recognized them. Moments of déjà vu flickered at odd intervals, and they felt an inexplicable awareness of the terrain even where the path vanished entirely beneath the undergrowth. They told themselves it was adrenaline, the sharpened senses of someone stepping into unknown territory. But the feeling persisted, subtle and unsettling. When they finally reached the perimeter of the Donnelly settlement, they paused not from exhaustion but from the overwhelming sense that they had arrived somewhere they were always meant to find. It was an irrational thought, one that clashed with their scientific training, but it lingered nonetheless. The decaying structures, the eerie silence, the lingering scent of damp earth and old wood, it all felt strangely familiar, as though they were not discovering the place for the first time but returning to it. The arrival of the researcher was not just the beginning of an investigation but the continuation of a story that had started long before they were born, a story written into the land, the ledger, and perhaps even their own blood without their knowledge. The unearthing of the sealed basement room beneath the Donnelly homestead marked the moment when curiosity transformed into dread, when the researcher realized they were no longer simply tracing a family history but trespassing into a place where generations had wrestled with something far beyond their control. The basement was not immediately visible upon entering the house. At first glance, the homestead seemed ordinary in its decay, collapsed roof beams, warped floorboards, and dust drifting like ash through the cold, stagnant air. Yet as the researcher moved through the rooms, mapping out the structure's layout, they noticed subtle inconsistencies that hinted at something concealed. Measurements didn't align, walls met at angles that didn't match the exterior dimensions, and the floor in one corner of the main room sounded hollow in a way that suggested more than simple rot. It was this hollow echo that drew the researcher back again and again until they finally began to pry away the warped floorboards. Beneath the layers of mud, splinters, and debris, their fingers grazed cold metal. With effort, they uncovered a rusted iron ring, fused to a square hatch hidden under decades of grime. The hatch was sealed shut with bolts that had blackened with age, the heads worn smooth as if someone had repeatedly tightened them long after the need for secrecy had passed. It took over an hour of careful work to loosen them, each groan of the metal echoing through the empty house like the building itself was protesting the intrusion. When the final bolt gave way, a gust of stale, trapped air rushed upward, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of chemical preservatives blended with something older, something that prickled the back of the throat. The ladder leading downward was sturdy despite the years, too sturdy to have been constructed casually. Its rungs were thick, reinforced, and designed for repeated, deliberate use. That detail alone unsettled the researcher. A family living in isolation might fortify their homes, but few would fortify a basement ladder unless they descended regularly into a place they feared as much as they depended upon. The descent felt like sinking into another world entirely. The narrow space swallowed light, and each step below amplified the sensation of being watched by the darkness itself. When the researcher's lantern finally pierced the room below, the beam revealed shelves lining the walls, filled with jars containing liquids that varied from amber to deep red. Some held preserved tissues or malformed structures that twisted in ways no natural organism should. Others contained fluids without any visible specimen, yet still carried labels written in the same frantic script found throughout the house above. Moving deeper into the room, the researcher found notebooks stacked in uneven piles, some neatly bound, others hastily tied together with strips of cloth. The earliest entries were written with clinical detachment, describing observations of family members who exhibited unusual traits. The tone mirrored that of the rural physician's ledger, suggesting that the Donnellys had once attempted to understand their own abnormalities from a scientific standpoint. However, as the generations progressed, the entries grew darker. Words pressed deeper into the paper, margins filled with corrections, diagrams overwritten so many times the pages tore. The drawings showed skeletal structures that bent in impossible angles, musculature that didn't match human anatomy, and blood samples reacting violently to heat or light. Some diagrams were scratched out entirely, leaving only scars on the pages that seemed to pulse with the fear of the person who had tried to erase them. One wall of the basement held a row of wooden crates, each labeled with a number corresponding to an entry in the notebooks. Inside were remnants of previous corrections, as the notes called them. The term sent a shiver down the researcher's spine because it implied not observation but intervention. Not attempts to understand the anomaly, but attempts to alter it. Tools lay scattered across a central table, scalpels, calipers, bone saws, meticulously cleaned yet visibly worn. There were stains on the table that had soaked so deeply into the grain they could never have been removed. The researcher imagined the Donnellys working here by lantern light, their faces drawn with desperation as they tried to address something that kept evolving faster than their understanding. But it wasn't the jars, the diagrams, or even the remnants of failed experiments that left the researcher trembling. It was the final notebook, its pages brittle, its cover warped by moisture. Unlike the others, this one contained no drawings, only tightly packed writing that grew smaller as the entries progressed. The text described a shift in the family line, children born with traits the older generations had never documented, behaviors that defied the boundaries of instinct. The writer pleaded with future generations not to continue the work, urging them to bury the truth, seal the room, and pray that nature would correct what human hands could not. The last entry ended abruptly, mid-sentence, the ink smeared as if the writer had been interrupted. When the researcher closed the notebook, they noticed scratch marks along the inside of the basement door, frantic, ragged marks carved by someone trying to force their way out or perhaps by something trying to keep something in. The deeper the researcher explored the basement, the more impossible it became to dismiss the feeling that the Donnellys had not simply suffered from a genetic anomaly but had been battling an inheritance that grew more volatile with every generation, something that changed them from within and left them trapped between science and nightmare, an inheritance the researcher now realized they might already be entangled with. The encounter with the last surviving Donnelly began with a sound so faint. The researcher almost dismissed it as the shifting of the old house settling under its own weight. But the noise persisted, a slow, deliberate scrape that rose from somewhere beyond the hallway they had not yet explored. It was the kind of sound that suggested intention rather than accident, and it froze the air in their lungs. Until that moment, the house had felt abandoned, its silence oppressive but inanimate. Now the silence seemed disturbed by a presence that had been waiting far longer than they had been trespassing. The researcher followed the sound, lantern trembling in their hand, illuminating fragments of dust that hung like suspended ash. The hallway was narrow, lined with warped portraits whose subjects' features had faded into ghostly outlines. As the researcher passed them, the feeling of being watched grew so palpable it felt as though the walls themselves carried memory. The sound came again, closer this time, and the researcher felt a flicker of recognition they couldn't explain, the eerie sensation that whatever awaited them was not a stranger but something familiar in a way that defied logic. When they reached the final door, they hesitated. It was slightly ajar, a thin crack of darkness cutting across the floor. The hinge groaned softly as the researcher nudged it open, revealing a room that appeared to be a makeshift living space, untouched by the chaotic decay of the rest of the house. The air was warmer, the blankets on the cot freshly disturbed, and the lantern's light caught the shimmer of water in a bowl set neatly by the bedside. Someone had been here recently. Someone was still here. From the shadowed corner of the room, a figure shifted, rising slowly as though every movement carried decades of weariness. At first the researcher saw only the outline, a tall, thin silhouette, posture slightly hunched, limbs too long to be entirely comfortable in the confined space. Then the lantern's glow revealed the face, and the researcher felt a jolt of shock wrapped in an inexplicable sense of recognition. The man's features were unmistakably human but altered in ways the researcher's mind struggled to reconcile. His skin carried an unusual pallor, stretched taut over bones that seemed subtly misaligned beneath the surface. His eyes, large and dark, reflected the lantern light with a sheen more animal than human, and yet there was unmistakable intelligence behind them, an awareness sharpened to a point. The man watched the researcher with an intensity that bordered on hunger and familiarity all at once. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, as though unused for years, but it carried a strange certainty. "You came back," he said, and though the words were simple, they hit the researcher with the weight of something ancient. The researcher tried to respond, to explain who they were and why they had come, but their voice cracked under the pressure of confusion and fear. The man stepped forward, his movements fluid yet uncomfortably silent, and as he approached, the details of his altered anatomy grew more distinct. His fingers were too long, joints subtly pronounced, and his gait had a rhythm that seemed to echo the mutations described in the basement notebooks. Yet he wasn't monstrous, not entirely. There was an undeniable humanity in the sorrow carved across his expression, in the faint tremor that shook his hands as he reached out toward the lantern light. He studied the researcher with a mixture of longing and caution, as if torn between approaching a long-lost relative and defending himself against an intruder. As the researchers' initial terror gave way to stunned curiosity, they found themselves unable to look away. Something in the man's features resonated with them on a level deeper than logic. His cheekbones, the shape of his jaw, the faint tilt of his eyes, they mirrored elements of the researcher's own face with unsettling precision. The realization hit like a blow. This man wasn't simply the last surviving Donnelly. He was a relative, perhaps distant, perhaps not distant at all. The genetic anomaly that had plagued the Donnelly line wasn't confined to the isolated family in the forest. It had branched outward, quietly threading itself through bloodlines that had dispersed over the decades. The researcher might not have known the Donnelly name before this investigation, but the Donnelly blood had known them. The surviving Donnelly seemed to sense the shift in the researcher's understanding. He moved closer, stopping only when he stood within arm's reach. His nostrils flared slightly, as though taking in the researcher's presence through senses sharper than those of an ordinary human. A look of profound recognition crossed his face, mingling grief, relief, and something darker, something protective and possessive at once. "It called you back," he murmured, tapping a long finger against his temple. "It never lets us go. Not one of us." The words carried more truth than the researcher wished to accept, confirming what the basement records had implied. The anomaly was not merely biological but persistent, binding its carriers in ways science had never accounted for. The last surviving Donnelly stepped back, retreating into the shadows with a grace that made the researcher's skin crawl. His eyes glimmered in the dim light like a reflection from some deep pool. "You should not have come alone," he said, voice soft but weighted with warning. "And you should not stay. It's waking. It knows you're here." The lantern flickered as a chill swept through the room, and the researcher realized with a dawning sense of horror that the encounter was not simply a meeting between two surviving strands of a fractured lineage. It was a threshold moment, the point at which everything the Donnellys had tried to suppress for generations began to stir again in the presence of new blood that matched its own. The revelation of the family's secret pact emerged not through a single discovery but through a series of converging realizations that clawed their way into the researcher's understanding. It began with the final notebook found in the sealed basement, where the desperate handwriting devolved into frantic warnings, but the truth did not settle fully until the surviving Donnelly spoke of something waking. The words lingered in the researcher's mind long after they left the dim room, vibrating with a meaning deeper than simple superstition. As they pieced the fragments together, the erased census records, the sealed chamber filled with abandoned attempts at control, the wary behavior of the townspeople, a chilling pattern began to form. The Donnellys had not been ostracized by the surrounding community. They had been protected, and feared, and contained. Generations earlier, the family had reached a point of desperation that pushed them to seek help outside their bloodline. The earliest entries in the basement notebooks suggested that the initial mutations were minor, subtle enough to be mistaken for harmless peculiarities. A child born with unusual reflexes, another with uncanny night vision, another whose illnesses resolved without treatment in ways that baffled the local doctor. But as generations passed, the mutations intensified, branching into traits that defied the boundaries of natural evolution. The family grew increasingly isolated, not by choice but by necessity. Their physical differences became more pronounced, their behaviors more unpredictable, and the surrounding towns grew more suspicious each time a Donnelly ventured beyond the forest. When livestock turned up mutilated in ways that suggested powerful hands rather than animal fangs, rumors spread like wildfire. But rather than confront the Donnellys or force them out, the townspeople did something far more unnerving: they formed a pact. The hints of this pact were subtle at first, references in old church meeting minutes, obscure notes in county ledgers that had been hastily crossed out, stories whispered by elders who refused to elaborate. But the surviving Donnelly confirmed what the researcher had begun to suspect. Decades earlier, when the family's condition escalated into something dangerous, the townspeople proposed an agreement. They would bring the Donnellys supplies and medical goods, keep outsiders away from the forests, erase any official documentation that tied the family to the region, and protect their secret for as long as the family lived. In return, the Donnellys agreed never to leave the settlement again. The pact was not motivated by compassion alone. The townspeople were deeply superstitious, convinced that the anomaly afflicting the Donnellys was not merely genetic but cursed, a punishment or omen that should not be allowed to spread. Yet beneath the fear lay another emotion: guilt. Many believed the anomaly had roots in an old transgression committed by early settlers, something lost to time but carried forward in blood. The pact represented not only containment but penance, a communal attempt to atone for sins none of them remembered clearly yet felt responsible for preserving. For generations, the townspeople upheld their end of the pact, until maintaining the secret became a ritual so ingrained it no longer needed to be spoken. Children were taught never to enter the forest. Outsiders were discouraged from exploring the mountains. And whenever strange sounds echoed across the valley, the residents locked their doors and pretended not to hear. But the Donnelly bloodline continued to evolve in ways no one predicted. The traits that began as minor anomalies blossomed into something more volatile. Some family members disappeared into the woods entirely, consumed by transformations never recorded in the notebooks. Others remained in the settlement, attempting to restrain or reverse the progression through increasingly desperate measures. The sealed basement was not simply a workspace, it was a battleground where science and instinct fought a losing war against something far older and more insistent. Eventually, the pact fractured. The townspeople began to fear not just the Donnellys but the possibility that the anomaly might escape the forest. Some insisted the family should be eradicated, but others argued that interfering more directly might unleash consequences far worse. In the end, the decision was made to sever their support entirely. They stopped delivering supplies. They removed every path leading into the forest from their maps. They let the settlement wither, hoping starvation, exposure, or time would bring the Donnelly line to an end. They assumed the forest would bury the truth. But the anomaly proved more resilient than they imagined. The presence of the surviving Donnelly was evidence of that. His altered features, his uncanny senses, his recognition of the researcher's blood, they all pointed to an inheritance that refused to vanish, one that had escaped the pact's containment far earlier than anyone realized. The townspeople believed they had avoided contamination by cutting ties, but the truth lay in the researcher's very existence. The Donnelly blood had already threaded its way into the outside world. Hidden across branches of the family tree that broke away before the pact was formed. The surviving Donnelly explained it with an eerie calm: the forest settlement was never a prison. It was a quarantine. And now, with the researcher's arrival, the anomaly had awakened to a familiar signature, a genetic echo returning to the forgotten source of its origin. The pact had failed long before the researcher was born, and the townspeople's silence had allowed the anomaly to drift quietly through generations, dormant but persistent, waiting for a moment when bloodlines would converge again. The revelation left the researcher standing at the threshold of a truth far more harrowing than the mysteries they had intended to solve. The Donnelly secret was not merely historical, nor was it confined to one isolated family. It was alive, aware, and reaching outward through time and heredity, and the researcher realized with numbing certainty that their arrival had not just uncovered the past, it had awakened their own future.